On a freezing winter evening in Cedar Falls, a decorated former Navy SEAL named Logan Reed thought he had already survived the worst life could throw at him, until he saw a pair of trembling amber eyes staring at him from beneath a rusted truck. The creature hiding there wasn't an enemy, nor a threat, but a half-starved German shepherd pup clutching a torn, stuffed rabbit, as if it were the last piece of safety left in the world. Logan had no idea that saving that tiny life would drag him into a dangerous confrontation with a violent breeder, reopen wounds he'd spent years trying to bury, and lead him to a silent little girl who hadn't spoken since the day she lost her parents. But the moment Ranger, the broken dog, curled against his chest, something inside Logan shifted. This wasn't just rescue. This was destiny linking two shattered souls on a collision course with healing, justice, and a miracle no one in town expected. Before we begin this journey of courage and redemption, comment where you're listening from, or simply type Amen to bless everyone walking their own silent battles today. Rain had a way of swallowing sound in Cedar Falls. It didn't fall in soft curtains like the coastal towns farther west. It hammered steady and heavy, as if the sky itself carried a grudge. Logan Reed knew that sound better than most. At nearly 50, with a weathered jaw and a deep crease between his brows, he had learned to measure days not by the clock, but by the rhythm of the rain against the metal roof of his cabin. His right leg, torn up by an IED during his final deployment with the Navy SEALs, ached with every shift of pressure, so he always felt the storm before it came. Today, it throbbed like a warning. He stepped out of the Cedar Falls post office, the automatic doors exhaling behind him. Logan wasn't tall anymore, not the way he had been before the injury, but his shoulders were broad, and his presence carried the quiet gravity of someone who had lived through things people only saw in movies. His hair, once black, had faded to steel gray, cut short in the habit of men who could never quite stop being soldiers. A faint scar ran from his temple down to his cheekbone, not jagged, but smooth, the mark of shrapnel removed too late. He barely felt the rain hitting his face. He was used to discomfort. It was silence he feared. He climbed into his Ford F-150, an older model but kept in meticulous condition. The pedals had been modified with a hand-control brake and accelerator, black anodized metal bars that curved upward beside the steering wheel. He had installed them himself the first winter after he left the service, when the doctors told him he'd never have full strength in his leg again. The truck smelled like cedar and cold leather. It was the closest thing he had to a sanctuary. The wipers dragged across the windshield, pushing aside thick streaks of water, but the sky remained a somber gray sheet. Logan pulled onto Mill Creek Road, the familiar stretch that sloped downhill toward his cabin. Fir trees blurred into dark green columns, and the roadside ditch churned with muddy water. He could have driven home with his eyes half closed. He knew this road the way soldiers knew the routes to their extraction points. But halfway down the hill, he slowed without knowing why. His instincts, honed through decades of scanning rooftops, alleyways, and desert ridges, caught on something. To his right stood the old lumberyard, abandoned for years. Its chain-link fence sagged inward, choked with vines. Stacks of warped pallets lay scattered like forgotten gravestones. A rusted cargo truck slumped near the entrance, its wheels half buried in mud. Logan flicked on his hazard lights. Something moved under the truck. Not the quick skitter of raccoons or the furtive twitch of foxes. This movement was slow, trembling. He eased himself out of the truck, bracing on his metal crutch, dark walnut wood, hand-carved, polished smooth from years of use. Rain pooled instantly on his jacket. He approached the old truck carefully, leaning down. Underneath, curled against the back axle, was a puppy. A German shepherd, but barely recognizably so, 4 months old at most, completely soaked, ribs pressing sharply through its thin silver and black coat. Its fur clumped together in muddy strands, and its paws shook uncontrollably. The pup's eyes, amber, enormous, and full of raw fear, locked onto Logan's face like he was the first living thing it had seen in days. In its mouth, clenched so tightly the fabric was tearing, was a small stuffed rabbit. One ear missing, the body patched with grime. The toy looked like it had been dragged through a storm, yet the puppy held it as if the world would disappear if it let go. Logan froze. His breath hitched in a way he hadn't allowed it to in years. He knew that expression. He'd seen it in soldiers pulled from collapsed buildings, in children caught between fronts, and in the mirror after the day he left his team behind. Abandonment left a mark you couldn't wash off. "Hey there," he murmured, voice low and steady, the same tone he used to soothe new SEAL recruits during live fire drills. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." The puppy whimpered but didn't retreat. It was too weak to run. Logan lowered himself onto one knee, ignoring the sting in his damaged leg. He extended a hand, palm open. Rain dripped from his fingers onto the mud. The puppy blinked slowly, then inched forward. Not trusting, just desperate. When its nose brushed his hand, Logan felt something crack inside him, something he thought had calcified years ago. He reached out gently, lifting the fragile body. The pup didn't resist. It only curled into the warmth of his chest, burying its face in the crook of his arm while still gripping the rabbit. Logan stood, his legs swaying under the weight, and carried the puppy back to his truck. Inside the cab, he turned up the heater, wrapped the pup in an old flannel shirt, and listened as its trembling slowly eased. It made a tiny sound, half whine, half sigh, that felt like a quiet surrender. He could have driven home. He could have fed it, bathed it, hoped that was enough. But Logan didn't survive the Navy SEALs by ignoring procedure. If someone tried to claim this puppy later, someone who had clearly abused it, he needed legal proof of its condition the moment he found it. So he drove straight to the Cedar Falls Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Mark Daniels was a man in his early 60s, built like an oak tree that had weathered too many winters. Broad shoulders, rough hands, a trimmed salt and pepper beard, and sharp blue eyes that missed little. He had the calm patience of someone who'd spent decades breaking up bar fights and rescuing hikers who thought they were invincible. Daniels had known Logan since the day he moved into that cabin by the woods. He respected him, not just for his service, but for the quiet dignity the man carried. When Logan entered, soaked through and cradling the puppy like a fallen comrade, Daniels raised an eyebrow. "You bring me trouble or a miracle?" "Maybe both," Logan answered. He set the puppy gently on the desk. Daniels leaned forward, studying the protruding ribs, the bruised skin along its flanks. His jaw tightened. "Damn," he muttered. "Somebody did a number on this little guy." Logan nodded once. "I want to file a found animal report. Document everything. If someone tries to claim him later, I want the record to show what shape he was in." Daniels grabbed a form and began filling out the details. "Name?" Logan hesitated. He looked at the puppy, Silver Sable, shivering but watching him with those enormous amber eyes. "Ranger," he said quietly. Daniels wrote it down. Logan signed the bottom. Logan Reed, printed in block letters, And just like that, the puppy had a name, a record, and, though Logan didn't say it out loud yet, a place in his life, a new mission, and one he intended to see through. The rain softened overnight, settling into a gentle hiss against the cedar shingles of Logan's cabin. The structure itself stood like a stubborn relic at the edge of the forest. 2 stories of weathered wood, a sagging porch railing, and a metal chimney that puffed thin smoke in the mornings. Logan pushed the door open with his shoulder, keeping Ranger tucked securely in his arms. The puppy's fur was still damp, though the truck's heater had helped. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine, coffee grounds, and old books. Logan set Ranger down gently on the braided rug near the living room table. Ranger immediately darted beneath the heavy oak table, the kind of handmade piece Logan had built years ago from reclaimed lumber. The puppy crouched so tightly his belly pressed against the floor, and the stuffed rabbit, his tattered treasure, lay between his front paws. Logan took a slow step forward, leaning heavily on his walnut crutch. The moment the crutch thumped against the wooden floor, Ranger flinched violently, scrambling deeper into the shadows. Logan froze. He looked down at the crutch, then at the trembling pup. What had been his mobility, his lifeline, had become a symbol of terror for the dog. He exhaled slowly, lowering himself until he sat on the floor. His injured leg protested, but he ignored it. With a quiet motion, he set the crutch aside. "It's okay," he murmured, voice low and gravelly from years of shouting commands over rotor blades and gunfire. "This isn't a weapon. Not here." Ranger's amber eyes flicked toward him. Logan leaned back against the couch, legs stretched in front of him, hands resting palms up on his thighs. He didn't move closer. He let the silence do the work. After a few minutes, he began talking, not with expectation, but with familiarity. He told the puppy about Afghanistan, about dust-choked valleys and night raids illuminated only by moonlight. He spoke of the blast that took out half his team, the reason he still walked with a metal hinge instead of a steady right leg. His voice didn't break, but there was a roughness in it, as if each word scraped the inside of his chest. He wasn't sure how long he spoke. Time in that cabin often blurred, but eventually, Ranger inched forward, the stuffed rabbit still clamped between his teeth. He placed his chin on Logan's boot. Logan didn't reach down. He merely let the moment be. 2 broken creatures acknowledging each other's wounds. That night, Logan laid a thick wool blanket on the living room floor for Ranger, but the pup refused to leave the table's shadow. Logan himself went to bed in the 2nd-story loft, a simple space with a single window overlooking the tree line. He'd barely drifted off before the dreams rose up, sand exploding beneath his feet, metal shrapnel tearing through the air, voices shouting his name, then fading into nothing. His breaths came hot and harsh as he fought the phantom weight pressing on his chest. Something warm nudged him. He startled awake to find Ranger trembling beside him, paws awkward on the comforter, eyes wide with concern. The pup nudged him again, then pressed his skinny body against Logan's ribs, grounding him, as though determined to pull him out from under whatever nightmare held him hostage. Logan's breath steadied. He let his fingers brush through Ranger's coat. "You're all right," he whispered to the dog, though he knew the truth was reversed. The dog had saved him. Again. By dawn, the rain had turned into a steady drizzle. Logan carried Ranger down the stairs, not wanting to risk the pup falling, and loaded him into the truck. The Timber Ridge Veterinary Clinic sat at the edge of town, a small white building with teal trim and a carved wooden sign depicting a happy golden retriever. Inside, the waiting room was warm and filled with framed photos of rescued animals. Dr. Ava Ramirez appeared from the back room, wiping her hands on a navy towel. She was a woman in her early 40s, of Latin descent, with long dark hair tied into a sleek ponytail and expressive almond-shaped eyes. She wore simple scrubs and carried herself with the no-nonsense authority of someone who'd spent her adult life handling frightened creatures. A faint scar near her right wrist, thin and pale, hinted at an old injury, most likely from a dog that had bitten out of fear, not malice. But instead of hardening her, it gave her a gentle patience. "Logan Reed," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Haven't seen you in months. Who's this little one?" "Found him yesterday," Logan said, placing Ranger gently on the exam table. "Under a truck near the lumber yard." Ava's trained eyes swept over the puppy. She didn't speak for a moment, only ran her fingers carefully along his ribs, feeling each bone beneath the skin. She pulled up an X-ray machine, took several images, then stared at them under the light panel. Her brows knitted. "He's been kicked," she said quietly. "Hard. More than once. Several of his ribs healed on their own, but not properly. He's dealing with malnutrition, worms, and dehydration." She paused, lifting one of Ranger's ears to examine the fur pattern. "He's a silver sable. That's rare. Dogs like this are usually expensive." Logan tightened his jaw. "So someone bred him to sell, then tossed him when he wasn't worth the trouble." Ava didn't disagree. "That's likely." She administered medication, gave Logan a care plan, and handed him a receipt with a tiny paw print sticker on the corner. "You did the right thing bringing him in." On the way back home, Logan stopped for fuel at the only gas station on Summit Road. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he stepped out, the damp wind carrying the smell of pine and diesel. As he pumped gas, a lifted gray Silverado rolled up across from him. Its driver, a broad, heavy-set man in his late 40s, stepped out with a swaggering gait. He had a thick neck, a reddish beard, and a face carved with deep lines, not from age, but from a lifetime of scowling. His name was Travis Harlan, and anyone in Cedar Falls who'd lived there long enough knew of him. He ran a backyard breeding operation out in the hills, a place locals whispered about but rarely confronted. Travis glanced at Logan briefly. Then his gaze drifted to the truck window where Ranger sat, ears perked nervously above the dashboard. Travis's expression sharpened. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled. "Looks like someone picked up my defective pup." Logan's grip tightened on the fuel nozzle. "Your what?" "That one," Travis said, jerking his thumb toward the puppy. "Didn't turn out the way I wanted. Too skittish. Not worth a dime. Tossed him out by the yard last week. Surprised he's still alive." Logan felt his pulse thrum in his neck. "You left him to die." Travis shrugged. "Business, Reed. Some dogs make money. Some don't. That one didn't." Logan didn't answer. He simply met Travis's eyes. Cold, unwavering, the stare of a man who had seen death up close and refused to be intimidated by petty cruelty. Travis scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and climbed back into his truck. But the seed of conflict had been planted, and both men knew it. Morning arrived with a pale mist rolling through Cedar Falls, a thin veil of silver hovering above the wet earth. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the pavement dark and shining. Logan Reed drove down the winding road that connected his cabin to the small downtown area. Ranger curled against the passenger seat with the stuffed rabbit between his paws. The puppy had grown more comfortable with the truck, though he still startled whenever a semi passed by. Traffic noise, engines, sudden clanks, any sound sharp enough to echo, made his ears flatten instantly. About halfway to town, the road curved around a small rise and revealed a white wooden house nestled beneath two towering maples. The house had peeling paint, a sagging front porch, and a weathered swing that hung from a rusted chain. It wasn't fancy, just lived in, worn and stubborn like most homes in Cedar Falls. Logan always slowed his truck a little when passing it, partly because the road narrowed, but mostly because something about the house caught Ranger's attention every single time. Today was no different. The puppy sat up abruptly, pressing his nose to the window. His tail quivered, not in fear, but in anticipation. Logan followed his gaze toward the porch. A young girl sat on the swing. She couldn't be older than 10. She wore a soft gray sweater a size too big, sleeves pushed halfway up her thin forearms. Her hair, light blonde with strands the color of honey, was braided loosely over her shoulder, the braid uneven as if she'd done it herself. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, like someone who hadn't spent much time outside. Her posture was small, shoulders drawn inward as if she were trying to fold herself into the background. But her eyes, large, blue, and watchful, were fixed on Ranger with an intensity that didn't match her stillness. Logan had heard about her. Emma Collins, a 10-year-old who'd moved to Cedar Falls after losing both parents in a high-speed freeway collision near Denver. People in town said she hadn't spoken a word since the accident. Some neighbors whispered terms like selective mutism. Others simply called it trauma. Logan recognized the signs: the silent staring, the retreat into oneself. He had seen soldiers return from missions with the same hollowed-out quiet, as if sound itself hurt. On the porch beside her, watering a pot of marigolds, stood a woman in her early 60s. She had silver-white hair tied back into a soft bun, skin tanned from years of work outdoors, and a round, warm face marked by gentle wrinkles. This was Ruth Collins, Emma's grandmother. She was the kind of woman who greeted strangers with a nod and friends with a plate of lemon cookies. She had raised her children in Cedar Falls and now found herself raising a granddaughter lost in grief. She looked up when Logan's truck passed, gave a faint wave, then glanced at Emma, her eyes full of a hope that had been disappointed many times. Ranger lifted his front paws onto the edge of the dashboard and stared at Emma. Not fearful, not nervous, just intensely curious. His ears angled forward, and his tail tapped lightly against the seat. Logan frowned gently. Ranger never reacted like this to strangers. The puppy avoided men with deep voices, flinched at tall silhouettes, and shrank from anything resembling a stick or rod. Yet here he was, leaning toward the window as if drawn by a magnet. Emma wasn't blinking. Her gaze, normally unfocused or fixed on the ground, was locked on Ranger with an unspoken connection. Not excitement, more like recognition. Two beings carrying different kinds of fear, but sharing the same quiet place inside. Logan pulled himself away from the moment and continued down the road, but the image stuck with him all day. The following Saturday, the drizzle had faded and sunlight filtered through thin clouds, casting warm patches across the cabin floor. Ranger trotted around, slightly more confident than before, though he still carried his stuffed rabbit like a security blanket. Logan watched him for a moment, then sighed. There was something he hadn't been able to ignore since the first time Ranger reacted to the girl. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. He loaded Ranger into the truck and drove toward town, stopping again in front of the White House. Ruth was sweeping the porch. Emma sat on the swing, wearing a navy dress patterned with tiny yellow flowers. She held a book in her lap, but wasn't reading it. Logan parked on the side of the road and stepped out carefully. Ruth looked up, smiling with polite curiosity. She was used to neighbors stopping by. Cedar Falls wasn't the type of place where people sped past one another. "Morning, Ruth," Logan said, his voice steady but gentler than usual. "Well, morning, Logan," she replied. Her voice was warm and lilting, with a slight raspy texture that hinted at years of speaking softly to keep from startling her granddaughter. "What brings you by?" Logan rubbed the back of his neck. Approaching people wasn't his strongest skill, not anymore, but some things were worth trying. "Mind if I introduce someone?" Ruth tilted her head. "Someone?" Logan opened the truck door. Ranger hopped down, landing lightly on the grass. Instead of shrinking behind Logan, the puppy looked straight toward Emma. His ears rose, his steps slow but purposeful. He carried the stuffed rabbit in his mouth. Ruth's broom paused. "Well now, that's new." Emma's book slid from her lap, falling silently to the porch floor. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but in a tiny burst of wonder that seemed to brighten her whole face. Logan approached the porch steps but stopped short so as not to overwhelm them. "He's had a rough start," he said quietly. "But he seems to notice your granddaughter. Thought maybe, if it's all right, he could meet her." Ruth studied Ranger thoughtfully. She had the perceptive gaze of someone who'd cared for hurt souls all her life. "Emma," she asked softly, "would you like to say hello?" Emma didn't move, but her eyes flicked to Ranger again. The puppy walked forward, carefully placing each paw as though the ground itself might break. He reached the edge of the porch, set the stuffed rabbit on the wooden step, then nudged it gently toward Emma. After that, he settled down beside it, his thin body pressing lightly against her shoes. Emma's lips parted. Air rushed out. No words, but a tiny, shaky breath that sounded like the start of something new. She lifted her hand, slowly, trembling like a leaf caught in a draft. Her fingers brushed Ranger's ear. The puppy leaned into her touch. A smile, small, hesitant, but entirely real, spread across Emma's face. It was the first time Logan had seen her expression change from anything other than quiet sorrow. Ruth covered her mouth with her hand, eyes glistening. Logan felt his throat tighten. Two beings who had been hurt beyond words had found each other in complete silence, communicating in a frequency the rest of the world had forgotten. Something had been unlocked. He didn't know what it meant yet, but whatever it was, he knew it mattered. The week after Ranger met Emma, Cedar Falls settled into an early stretch of autumn calm. The mornings were cool enough for breath to fog the air, and the smell of wet pine clung to everything. Logan drove the familiar descent toward town almost every day now. Ranger sat confidently on the passenger seat, a small but noticeable improvement from when he first trembled under the table at home. And every time the truck rolled past the Collins house, Ranger perked up, searching for the blonde girl on the porch. Emma's face lit up the moment she saw him. She still didn't speak, but her smile, fragile yet unmistakable, was becoming more frequent. It wasn't lost on Logan that this connection meant something delicate and rare, something worth protecting. During a checkup at Timber Ridge Veterinary Clinic, Dr. Ava Ramirez watched Ranger interacting with a toddler in the waiting room. The pup had approached the child slowly, sat at a respectful distance, then rolled gently onto his side as if offering trust. The toddler laughed, a sound like bells, and reached to touch Ranger's ear. Ava raised an eyebrow at Logan. "You've got a therapy dog in the making." Logan frowned, rubbing the stiff joint of his right knee. He's still scared of loud noises, and men, and tools, and sometimes shadows. "All the more reason," Ava replied, her voice even but warm. She wore her navy scrubs and white coat like armor, though her almond-shaped eyes softened when she spoke to animals. Emma responds to him. "That's not small. Dogs like Ranger can help trauma survivors because they understand fear but still choose connection." Logan didn't say anything. He knew Ava was right, but stepping into public spaces, training programs, classes, that meant leaving his safe isolation. Every time he thought he'd built a life where his wounds couldn't reach anyone else, Ranger and Emma had begun tugging him back toward the world. Word spread around Cedar Falls about the rare silver sable German Shepherd. In small towns, information traveled faster than wind. By the week's end, even the hardware store clerk, a wiry man named Cliff Walters with a handlebar mustache and a knack for gossip, had asked Logan, "That your pup everyone's talking about?" Logan gave a non-committal grunt. Ranger stayed close to his leg, scanning the aisles like a soldier in unfamiliar terrain. But not everyone in town admired Ranger. Travis Harlan had heard. Travis, the bulky, red-bearded backyard breeder, whose temper was matched only by his arrogance, believed one thing firmly: everything had a price, and everything belonged to him until he decided otherwise. Inside the darkened recesses of his operation, dogs were sources of income, not companionship. Travis was the kind of man who settled disputes by intimidation, leaning forward with shoulders squared, breath smelling of stale beer, and eyes narrowed beneath thick brows. His whole life had been shaped by dominance: a father who barked orders, a mother who retreated from conflict, a younger brother who left town at 18 and never called back. Travis grew up believing only the loudest survived, and he was furious that his discarded mutt was now the talk of town. Late in the afternoon, Logan turned from Summit Road onto the rugged dirt trail leading toward his cabin. Fir trees arched overhead, their tops swaying in the breeze. The road was narrow, winding around boulders and uneven ruts. Ranger's ears twitched at every snapping twig, but he stayed calm, an improvement Logan respected. Halfway up the incline, a lifted gray Silverado pulled out from behind a bend and blocked the road entirely. Mud splattered across its tires, and the engine idled with a low, aggressive growl. Logan recognized it immediately. Travis's truck. Logan exhaled through his nose, steady and slow. Ranger, sensing the tension, sat up straighter. Travis stepped out, slamming the door with more force than necessary. Today he wore a dirty flannel jacket, torn jeans, and heavy boots caked with dried mud. His reddish beard bristled as he smirked, revealing yellowed teeth. "Evening, Reed." Logan didn't raise his voice. "Move your truck." "Not yet." Travis swaggered closer, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Hear you've been showing off my dog around town." "Your dog?" Logan's tone remained calm, but his jaw tightened. He was dumped, injured, starved. Travis shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Got papers on him. Silver sable shepherds aren't cheap. You owe me compensation, or you hand him over." Logan leaned over, opened his glove compartment, and pulled out 2 documents, the found animal report filed with Sheriff Daniels, and the chip registration Ava had completed. He held them up. "Ranger is legally mine." Sheriff signed off. Travis snatched the papers, scanned them, and tossed them into the dirt. "Paperwork don't mean much out here." He walked toward the passenger side of Logan's truck. Ranger shrank back, ears flattening. "Back away," Logan said sharply. Travis ignored him. He grabbed a long iron bar from the bed of his truck. It was rusted and heavy, likely used for prying open crates. Without warning, he slammed it against Logan's passenger side door, right beside Ranger. The blow rang out like a gunshot. Ranger shrieked, scrambling wildly in the confined space, claws scraping against the window. His breath came in rapid, panicked bursts. The stuffed rabbit fell to the floor as he threw his body against the door, trying to escape the sound. Travis struck again and again. Each clang reverberated like an explosion. Logan's heart pounded, not in fear, but in anger sharpened into protective instinct. He saw the terror in Ranger's eyes, the same terror he'd seen in young soldiers pinned under fire. Travis wanted Ranger to lash out, to snap or bite, to create a reason to claim the dog was dangerous. Logan made a choice. He unbuckled his seatbelt, slid across the seat, and wrapped both arms tightly around Ranger. The dog shook so violently that Logan could feel every rib against his chest. "It's okay," he whispered, pressing Ranger's head to his sternum. "Listen to me, not the noise, just me." Another blow fell, metal screaming against metal, but Logan held Ranger tighter, absorbing the panic with his own body. He slowed his breathing deliberately, steady and rhythmic like he used to do during extraction missions. Ranger's trembling began to sync with the rise and fall of Logan's chest. Then, a deep voice cut through the chaos. "Put it down, Travis." Standing behind Travis was Sheriff Mark Daniels, broad-shouldered and stone-faced, wearing his brown deputy jacket and hat. His blue eyes were cold as winter steel. He must have followed the noise or happened upon the scene by chance. But either way, he took in everything. The iron bar, the dented truck, the terrified dog. Travis lowered the bar reluctantly. "Sheriff, this dog—" "I saw enough," Daniels snapped. "Step away from the vehicle. We're having a conversation at the station about animal cruelty, destruction of property, and harassment." Travis's face reddened, but he obeyed, muttering curses. Logan didn't let go of Ranger until the pup stopped shaking. Only then did he look up at Daniels. No words passed between them, but an understanding did. The fight hadn't required guns, fists, or military skill. Just loyalty, law, and a wounded dog who mattered more than pride. Winter arrived in Cedar Falls quietly that year, not with the brutal storms the town was used to, but with a slow settling of white powder across rooftops and pine branches. The days grew shorter, the air sharper, and the library windows glowed warmly each afternoon like lanterns against the gray sky. It was there, inside those quiet, book-scented walls, that Ranger began his new purpose. Months had passed since the confrontation on the mountain road. Ranger had grown into a young German shepherd with a silver sable coat that shimmered under light like brushed steel. His ribs no longer showed. Ava's nutrition plan had filled out his frame, giving him a healthy, athletic build. Yet his eyes remained thoughtful, deep amber pools that reflected every sound and movement. Loud noises still startled him, doors slamming, chairs scraping. But now, whenever fear pricked his instincts, he didn't panic. He looked first to Logan. Logan had changed too. He was still tall-shouldered but carried a softer posture, less like a soldier bracing for impact, and more like a guardian who had found something worth anchoring himself to. The scar along his cheek was the same, the limp in his right leg still part of his gait, but there was a looseness to his expression that Cedar Falls hadn't seen since he arrived years earlier. He had begun attending Ranger's therapy sessions, not out of obligation, but because he liked seeing what the dog became around children. The Cedar Falls Public Library was run by a single librarian, Mrs. Helen Marbury, a woman in her late 50s with short brown hair, streaks of gray, and a soft, round face framed by kind eyes behind thin metal glasses. She dressed in long cardigans and floral scarves, always smelling faintly of cinnamon tea. Helen had a patient personality shaped by years of reading to children who couldn't sit still, and she had personally arranged the Reading with Ranger mat, a soft green rug in the children's corner, decorated with felt pine trees and fabric sleds sewn by volunteers. Ranger settled onto that rug each Saturday afternoon. Children approached timidly at first, then eagerly, drawn by the combination of his gentle expression and his rare coloring. Logan sat off to the side, his crutch resting against his knee, watching every interaction with the alertness of someone who had once guarded lives in far harsher places. Emma arrived one early winter afternoon, bundled in a puffy blue coat with a knitted white scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. Her blonde hair peeked from beneath a wool hat, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. She clutched a picture book against her chest, a book about a lone wolf searching for its pack. Ruth accompanied her, of course. The older woman wore a brown quilted jacket and thick gloves, her breath forming small clouds as she spoke quietly to Helen. Emma stepped into the children's corner, moving with the same soft, cautious rhythm she had carried since the accident. She lowered herself onto the rug, just inches from Ranger, and slid her small hand into the thick fur along his neck. Ranger responded instantly, leaning into her side with a low, contented exhale, his tail brushing gently against her boot. The room hushed. The other children quieted. Even Helen lowered the volume of her page-turning behind the desk. Logan watched from across the room, arms folded loosely over his chest. Ruth stood near him, hands clasped, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. Emma stared at Ranger, her breath steadying. She had spent many Saturdays sitting beside him, touching his fur, occasionally miming the shape of words. She had never spoken, not once. But each week she leaned a little closer, stayed a little longer, trusted a little more. Today felt different. Logan sensed it the way a seal senses a change in the wind before dawn. Emma held her book tightly, then loosened her grip. Slowly, she opened it to the first page. Ranger lowered his head onto her lap. The room stilled. Emma inhaled, a soft, trembling breath, and then, barely above a whisper, released a single word. Ranger. It was the smallest sound, fragile and breathy, but it carried through the air with the force of a flare shot across a dark sky. Ranger lifted his head, ears forward. Logan's heart clenched. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. Ava, who had stopped by that day to donate snacks, froze in the doorway. Even Sheriff Daniels, leaning casually against a shelf, straightened abruptly, his weathered face cracking into an unguarded smile. Emma looked down at Ranger again, gathered courage, and spoke a little louder. Ranger. The dog nudged her knee gently, encouraging. She began to read, not fluently, not smoothly, but in careful, halting syllables that had been locked inside her for 2 long years. The wolf was alone. Her small fingers tightened on Ranger's fur as she stumbled over each word. Ranger didn't move except to breathe evenly, giving her an anchor, something to tether her voice to so it wouldn't disappear. The adults cried quietly. Logan didn't wipe his eyes, but his throat tightened to the point of pain. He had spent years believing he couldn't bring anything good into the world anymore, that his usefulness had been buried under the rubble of his final deployment. But here was Emma, broken in ways he understood, finding her way back because Ranger had found his way to him. When the session ended, Emma closed her book, her eyes shining with relief and pride. She reached into her coat, pulled out a small wrapped item, and placed it in Ranger's paws. It was a new stuffed rabbit. Not perfect. Its seams were uneven, and one ear was slightly larger than the other. But it was handmade with scraps of fabric Ruth had gathered, including a square of flannel in red and blue taken from one of Logan's old shirts. Emma had stitched it herself, clumsy but determined. Ranger picked up the new rabbit carefully, then pressed his nose against the old one, as if acknowledging both his past and his future. He carried both toys as Logan helped him into the truck. Snow had begun falling softly, dusting rooftops and blanketing the town in white. Logan started the engine, the heater humming to life. Ranger curled up on the passenger seat, hugging both stuffed rabbits to his chest. Emma and Ruth waved from the library steps. Ava, Daniels, and Helen stood behind them, each touched by a quiet triumph. Logan drove through the snowy streets with a heart that felt strangely light. He knew he would never run across Coronado Beach like he once had. His leg would never be whole. His nightmares might never fully leave. But broken things could still protect. Broken people could still love. And sometimes, broken souls found each other in the most unexpected places. A rain-soaked lumberyard, a lonely cabin, a silent girl on a porch. As the truck disappeared into the forest road, the falling snow swallowed the sound of its engine, leaving behind only the warmth of a town where a dog reclaimed his purpose, and a girl reclaimed her voice.